In the 1970s, life on a farm was as much about the food as it was about the work. Farms weren't just fields of crops and barns full of livestock. They were kitchens, filled with the hum of busy mothers, fathers, and kids learning the art of making something from nothing. For farm families, meals weren't just about feeding the body. They were about resourcefulness, tradition, and stretching what you had into something hearty and fulfilling. No recipe was too complicated, no ingredient went to waste, and every meal was an opportunity to come together around the table after a long day of hard work. The meals that graced farm tables during this time were simple but comforting, built on the foundation of homegrown ingredients and resourceful cooking. From dishes made with freshly butchered meat to casseroles that stretched leftovers into a filling meal, farm cooking was as much about ingenuity as it was about taste. With a deep reliance on the seasons, farm families learned how to preserve the harvest, make use of every scrap, and create meals that could nourish a family for days on end. Dish 1. Scrambled eggs with fried potatoes. In the early mornings of the 1970s, while the rooster crowed and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon, scrambled eggs with fried potatoes were the fuel that kept farm families going. It was the kind of breakfast you could make with minimal ingredients, but still feel like you'd eaten something substantial enough to get through the hard work ahead. Eggs, fresh from the henhouse, paired with potatoes dug straight from the garden, formed the backbone of this meal. A simple, earthy combination that could be whipped up in a matter of minutes, yet tasted like comfort itself. Farm families knew the value of good eggs. The hens on the farm weren't just animals. They were part of the rhythm of the day, their clucks and pecks as much a part of the farm's heartbeat as the tractor's rumble or the cow's low moos. Scrambled eggs, then, were a quick, satisfying meal made from something that required little more than a few minutes of cooking time. Paired with potatoes, sometimes fresh, sometimes stored in the root cellar, but always starchy and satisfying, the meal was the epitome of farm practicality. The potatoes were often sliced thin and fried in a heavy pan with butter until they were golden brown and slightly crispy on the edges, with just a hint of softness in the center. The smell of them sizzling in the pan was enough to get everyone out of bed, and the eggs, scrambled with a little salt, pepper, and perhaps a touch of milk, added a creamy contrast to the crunch of the potatoes. It was a meal that didn't need much else. In fact, sometimes, it didn't need anything more than a slice of homemade bread to scoop up the last bits of yolk and crispy potato. And that's the charm of scrambled eggs with fried potatoes. It was simple and unpretentious, but it made you feel like you could take on anything, whether served in the morning before heading out to the barn or enjoyed as a satisfying dinner. After a long day, this dish was both a reflection of the farm family's values, efficiency, simplicity, and comfort, and a celebration of the humble, hearty ingredients they had at their disposal. Dish 2. Creamed chipped beef on toast, SOS. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately known as SOS, might not win any culinary awards, but it's undeniably a beloved classic in farm kitchens and military mess halls alike. Born out of practicality during World War II, when dried beef and canned goods were in abundance, this dish became a reliable comfort food for families on the farm in the 1970s. It's a dish that, despite its humble origins, provided the kind of hearty sustenance needed to fuel long days of hard work. The main ingredient, dried chipped beef, was often purchased in large jars or packages, making it a pantry staple. This preserved meat could be kept for months without refrigeration, a true convenience for farm families who needed non-perishable supplies. While it might have lacked the fresh, farm-raised meat many farm families enjoyed, chipped beef was easy to store and use in a variety of dishes. To make creamed chipped beef on toast, the dried beef was first sliced into small pieces and quickly sautéed in a skillet to bring out its savory, salty flavor. A simple roux, made from butter and flour, was then added to the pan to thicken the gravy. Milk was slowly stirred in, creating a creamy sauce that coated the beef and transformed it into a rich, comforting dish. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of mustard or paprika, the sauce was the perfect balance of creamy, tangy, and salty. The mixture was then served over a slice of toasted bread, which acted as the base for the savory sauce. The crunch of the toast complemented the creamy texture of the beef and gravy, making each bite satisfying and filling. SOS was a dish that could be made quickly, with minimal ingredients, but still provided the kind of stick-to-your-ribs comfort that farm families needed after a long day in the fields. While it may have started as a wartime ration, it found its way into the hearts and kitchens of many, and its simplicity became its charm. For farm families in the 1970s, cream-chipped beef on toast wasn't just a meal. It was a comforting, hearty reminder of the resilience and resourcefulness of farm life. Dish 3. Chicken and dumplings. Few things are more soul-warming than a pot of chicken and dumplings simmering on the stove, filling the kitchen with the rich, comforting aroma of chicken broth and herbs. On the farm, this dish was a favorite during the colder months when the chickens had been raised and were ready to be cooked down into a hearty, filling meal. It was a dish that turned a simple bird into something magical, where the tender meat melted off the bone and the dumplings, those little clouds of dough, bobbed in a rich broth like floating pillows. Chicken and dumplings were the epitome of farm cooking, practical, humble, and yet undeniably satisfying. It was the kind of dish you could make with ingredients you likely already had on hand: chicken, flour, butter, milk, and a few seasonings. And it was as much about comfort as it was about nourishing a hungry family after a hard day's work. The chicken was first simmered in water with onions, garlic, and herbs like thyme and bay leaves, creating a fragrant broth. Once the meat was tender, the chicken was removed, and the broth was seasoned to perfection. The meat was then shredded and added back into the pot, where it would join the dumplings. These dumplings were made from flour, butter, milk, and a touch of baking powder, mixed into a dough and dropped into the simmering broth. As they cooked, they puffed up, absorbing the rich chicken flavor and becoming soft, pillowy bites of comfort. Serving chicken and dumplings was an occasion. The warmth of the broth, the tender chicken, and the delicate dumplings made every bite feel like a hug from the inside. Often, it was paired with a simple green salad or a slice of cornbread, but on the farm, the main event was always the dish itself. The beauty of chicken and dumplings lay in its simplicity, the way basic, homegrown ingredients could transform into something so much greater than the sum of their parts. It wasn't just dinner, it was the heart of the farm kitchen, a meal that brought everyone together around the table after a long, cold day. And it's that sense of warmth, both in the meal and in the company, that made chicken and dumplings a timeless favorite. Dish 4. Green bean casserole. Green bean casserole is one of those dishes that has become a staple in many homes, especially for farm families during the 1970s. It's a dish that reflects the resourcefulness of the time, simple ingredients transformed into something hearty and flavorful. While it's often associated with holiday meals or potlucks, it was also a comforting, everyday side dish that made the most of garden-fresh vegetables, like green beans, that could be canned or frozen for year-round use. The core ingredients of green bean casserole were straightforward: green beans, which could be freshly picked or preserved from the farm's garden, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. The soup served as the creamy, savory base that tied everything together. While the idea of canned soup as a base might sound a bit simplistic today, it was a convenient and reliable ingredient on the farm. It allowed farm families to prepare meals quickly, even after long days spent working in the fields. To make the casserole, green beans were first cooked and then combined with the soup, along with a bit of milk and seasonings like salt and pepper. The mixture was poured into a baking dish and topped with crispy fried onions, which would bake into a crunchy golden layer that contrasted perfectly with the creamy beans below. The casserole was then baked until the top was crisp and the beans were tender, allowing the flavors to meld together into a comforting, hearty side dish. Green bean casserole was easy to prepare in large quantities, making it an ideal dish for farm families who often had a big crowd to feed. It was also a great way to use up extra green beans, especially during the peak of harvest season. The dish was versatile too. Some farm families added grated cheese or bacon for extra flavor, while others mixed in a variety of vegetables, depending on what was available in the garden. For farm families in the 1970s, green bean casserole was more than just a side dish. It was a symbol of the resourcefulness and creativity that went into making the most of homegrown ingredients. It was a simple yet satisfying meal that brought the family together around the table, no matter the occasion. Dish 5. Beef stew with biscuits. If there's one dish that can make you feel like you're wrapped in a warm blanket after a long, exhausting day on the farm, it's beef stew with biscuits. A hearty, stick-to-your-ribs meal, beef stew was a farm family favorite in the 1970s. It was the kind of dish you could simmer for hours, filling the house with the intoxicating aroma of tender beef, root vegetables, and savory broth. The star of this dish was, of course, the beef. Often, it was a tougher cut. something that could stand up to slow cooking and become meltingly tender over time. Farm families were no strangers to making the most of every part of the animal, and beef stew was an ideal way to use less expensive cuts of meat while still getting a deeply flavorful result. The beef would be browned in a heavy pot to develop a rich, caramelized crust, and then slow cooked with onions, carrots, potatoes, and herbs, such as thyme and bay leaves. The vegetables would soften as they simmered in the rich beef broth, each bite bringing out the depth of flavor that only hours of slow cooking could provide. But the real magic of this meal lay in the biscuits. Biscuits, light and flaky, were the perfect companion to beef stew, offering a contrast in both texture and flavor. They soaked up the savory broth like sponges, their buttery goodness complementing the richness of the stew. The biscuit dough itself was simple: flour, butter, milk, and a little baking powder, mixed together quickly and dropped by the spoonful onto the simmering stew, where they would cook until golden brown on top. The result was a meal that filled both the belly and the soul, offering warmth, comfort, and satisfaction in every bite. Beef stew with biscuits wasn't just a meal, it was an event, something to look forward to after a hard day's work. It could be made in large batches, ensuring that there was enough to feed the whole family, and perhaps even a few extra mouths. And on those cold winter nights, when the winds howled outside and the snow piled up, there was nothing more comforting than a bowl of beef stew with a fresh biscuit, warm from the oven. It was a meal that celebrated the humble yet nourishing ingredients of the farm: meat, vegetables, and flour, and it became a beloved tradition in many farm households during the 1970s. Dish 6. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes. A meal that's as comforting as it is timeless. For farm families in the 1970s, this was the kind of dinner that could take center stage at any gathering. Whether it was a Sunday meal after church or a special occasion to celebrate a successful harvest, fried chicken with mashed potatoes was always a crowd pleaser. The fried chicken was often sourced from the farm itself. Raising chickens on the farm meant that when it came time for a meal, the bird was fresh, flavorful, and ready to be transformed into something golden and crispy. The chicken was seasoned, sometimes with just salt and pepper, other times with a more elaborate blend of spices, and then dredged in flour before being fried in hot oil until the skin was crackling and crisp. The result was chicken with a deeply satisfying crunch on the outside, while the meat inside remained tender and juicy. It was fried chicken that had been made with patience and care, and every bite tasted of the farm's own bounty. Alongside the fried chicken came the mashed potatoes. These were no instant potatoes. They were made from scratch, often with potatoes pulled from the garden or the root cellar. The potatoes were boiled until tender, then mashed with butter, milk, and a touch of salt and pepper. Some families added a little garlic or cream for extra richness, but the essence of mashed potatoes on the farm was simplicity. The creamy potatoes were the perfect accompaniment to the crispy chicken, and together they created a meal that felt like a warm embrace. There was something undeniably special about fried chicken and mashed potatoes. It was a meal that brought everyone to the table, gathered around the warmth of the kitchen and the comfort of food made with love. And on a farm, where meals were often hearty and filling, this dish stood out as one of the most beloved. Whether served on a weeknight or for a special celebration, fried chicken and mashed potatoes were the kind of meal that made you feel like you were home, no matter where you were. It was a reminder that the best meals didn't need to be fancy or complicated. They just needed to be made with care and shared with the people you loved. Dish 7. Meatloaf. In the 1970s, when times were tough and resources were limited, farm families knew how to make the most out of every ingredient they had. And one of the best ways to stretch a small amount of meat into a hearty meal for a whole family was by making meatloaf. The beauty of meatloaf lay in its simplicity and adaptability. It was a humble dish that took the most basic ingredients, ground beef or pork, breadcrumbs, and eggs, and transformed them into something filling and delicious. For farm families, meatloaf was both a way to use up leftovers and a great way to feed a crowd with minimal effort. Typically made with a mixture of ground beef, or sometimes a blend of beef and pork, breadcrumbs, and eggs, Meatloaf could be easily customized to suit personal tastes and whatever was available in the pantry. Salt, pepper, garlic, and onions were common seasonings, and if the family had it, a dash of Worcestershire sauce or a sprinkle of dried herbs would elevate the flavor. The ingredients were mixed together and shaped into a loaf, then baked slowly in the oven, where the meat would form a savory, flavorful crust while staying juicy and tender on the inside. One of the best parts of meatloaf was its versatility. You could serve it with mashed potatoes, a side of vegetables, or even smother it in a rich tomato-based sauce or gravy. Sometimes, a sweet and tangy ketchup glaze would top the loaf, adding a touch of sweetness to balance the savory meat. For farm families, meatloaf wasn't just a meal. It was a comfort food that could be easily made in large batches to feed a hungry crew after a long day of work. The leftovers were perfect for sandwiches the next day, making it a dish that kept on giving. But beyond the practicality, meatloaf also held sentimental value. It was a meal that could bring the family together, with everyone gathered around the table, enjoying a hearty dish made from the most basic of ingredients. It was the kind of food that filled you up, made you feel nourished, and reminded you of the resourcefulness and ingenuity that farm life required. Simple, filling, and satisfying, meatloaf was a dish that embodied the spirit of the 1970s farm family. Hardworking, humble, and always making the best of what they had. Dish 8. Cabbage rolls. Cabbage rolls are a classic, hearty dish that many farm families in the 1970s cherished. While the origins of this dish can be traced back to Eastern Europe, it became a beloved comfort food in farm kitchens across America, especially where cabbage was grown in abundance. For farm families, cabbage was a crop that could be harvested in large quantities, stored for the winter, and used in a variety of dishes. Cabbage rolls, also known as stuffed cabbage, offered a way to turn inexpensive ingredients into a meal that could feed a crowd, making it both practical and filling. To make cabbage rolls, the cabbage leaves were first softened by blanching them in boiling water. This step allowed the leaves to become pliable enough to roll without tearing. Once prepared, the leaves were carefully peeled off the head of cabbage and set aside. The filling, a mixture of ground meat, usually beef or pork, rice, onions, and seasonings, was then prepared. The rice helped stretch the meat, while the onions added flavor, and the seasonings, salt, pepper, and sometimes garlic, brought the entire filling to life. Each cabbage leaf was stuffed with the meat and rice mixture, then tightly rolled up and tucked into a baking dish. The rolls were nestled together snugly, ensuring that they would cook evenly. The rolls were then covered with a savory tomato sauce, often made with canned tomatoes, and baked slowly in the oven. The slow cooking allowed the flavors to meld together, with the cabbage becoming tender and the filling absorbing all the rich, tangy flavors of the sauce. Cabbage rolls were a versatile dish. They could be served on their own or alongside mashed potatoes or bread, which helped soak up the delicious sauce. Farm families often made large batches of cabbage rolls, knowing they could be enjoyed over several days. They also made excellent leftovers, with the flavors only intensifying as they sat. For many farm families in the 1970s, cabbage rolls represented not just a meal, but a connection to tradition and family. The dish was often passed down through generations, each family adding their own little twist, but always holding on to the essence of simplicity and resourcefulness. Dish 9. Cornbread and chili. Cornbread and chili, two humble dishes that, when paired together, form a meal that is both comforting and deeply satisfying. For farm families in the 1970s, this combination was a go-to dinner for cold nights and busy days. It was the kind of meal that could be made with what you had in the pantry, using simple ingredients to create something hearty enough to feed a crowd. Whether it was a Sunday supper after church or a quick, satisfying weeknight dinner, cornbread and chili was a staple that could bring the family together around the table. Chili, often made with ground beef or pork, was a dish that could easily be adapted to whatever was available. It didn't take much to make a delicious chili. Ground meat was browned and simmered with onions, garlic, and a generous amount of chili powder, cumin, and paprika, giving the dish its signature depth and warmth. Beans, usually kidney, pinto, or a combination, were added to bulk up the chili and stretch it further, making it a filling meal. Tomatoes, whether canned or fresh, formed the base of the sauce, and the chili would simmer for hours on the stovetop, filling the house with a mouth-watering aroma. The long cooking time allowed the flavors to meld together, creating a rich, savory stew with just the right amount of heat. But chili wasn't complete without cornbread. Cornbread was a staple in farm kitchens for good reason. It was easy to make, required only a few ingredients, and paired perfectly with hearty dishes like chili. Made with cornmeal, flour, eggs, milk, and a bit of sugar, cornbread had a subtly sweet flavor that balanced the spice of the chili. It was often baked in a cast-iron skillet, which gave it a crispy, golden crust, while the inside remained soft and moist. Some families added shredded cheese or jalapenos to the cornbread, giving it a little extra kick, but even plain cornbread was a beloved side. When served together, cornbread and chili created a perfect harmony of flavors. The cornbread soaked up the rich, flavorful chili, and each bite was a comforting, warming experience. It was a meal that could easily feed a large family, making it a go-to dish for farm kitchens in the 1970s. Cornbread and chili may have been simple, but it was always satisfying, filling the stomach and warming the soul. Dish 10, potato salad. Potato salad is one of those classic dishes that has stood the test of time in farm kitchens, and for good reason. It's simple, satisfying, and versatile. During the 1970s, when farm families were looking for ways to make the most out of their harvests, potato salad was often a go-to dish that could be made in large batches and served at any gathering. Whether for a picnic, a potluck, or a Sunday family dinner, potato salad was a staple that could easily be adapted depending on what ingredients were available in the pantry or garden. The base of potato salad was always the same: potatoes. Fresh, starchy potatoes that were either freshly dug from the garden or stored in the root cellar. These humble tubers were boiled until soft, but still firm enough to hold their shape when mixed with the dressing. The potatoes were then chopped into bite-sized pieces, ready to be transformed into the creamy, flavorful salad that would steal the show at the dinner table. While there were many variations, the classic 1970s version of potato salad was made with a creamy dressing, typically using mayonnaise as the base. A little bit of mustard and vinegar were added for tang, while salt and pepper brought balance to the dish. Chopped hard-boiled eggs, sweet pickles or relish, and sometimes onions or celery were mixed in, adding texture and flavor to the creamy base. The beauty of potato salad was that it could be made ahead of time, allowing the flavors to meld and develop as it sat in the fridge. This made it a perfect dish for busy farm families, especially during harvest season when time was precious. What made potato salad so beloved was its comforting, creamy texture and the balance of flavors. The sweetness of the pickles, the richness of the eggs, and the tangy dressing that held it all together. It was a dish that made the most of what you had on hand, transforming simple ingredients into something that could feed a crowd. And no matter where you served it, whether alongside fried chicken, barbecued ribs, or a simple roast, it was always a hit. In the 1970s, potato salad was a dish that brought families together, whether at the table or at a community gathering, and it remains a comforting reminder of farm kitchens and simpler times. Dish 11, baked beans with bacon. There's something about the smoky, sweet flavor of baked beans that evokes memories of sitting down to a hearty, comforting meal on a farm. Baked beans with bacon was a dish that made the most of pantry staples, often cooked in large quantities to feed a hungry family. For farm families in the 1970s, beans were an affordable and filling source of protein, and when combined with the rich flavor of bacon, they became a beloved side dish that could accompany everything from grilled meats to roasted chicken, or even serve as a main course for a meatless meal. The heart of this dish lay in the beans themselves, usually pinto or navy beans, which were soaked overnight to soften before cooking. After draining and rinsing, the beans would be simmered with onions, garlic, and sometimes a little molasses or brown sugar to add sweetness to the dish. What really set this dish apart, though, was the addition of bacon. Bacon, with its smoky, salty flavor, was an essential ingredient that gave the beans depth and richness. The bacon was chopped into small pieces and browned in a skillet, allowing the fat to render and infuse the beans with its savory flavor. The beans would then be combined with the bacon and baked in the oven, where they absorbed all the delicious flavors and became tender and flavorful. Sometimes, a little mustard or ketchup was added to the mix, giving the beans a tangy kick that balanced the sweetness. A touch of Worcestershire sauce or apple cider vinegar could also be stirred in for complexity, but the key to this dish was slow cooking, allowing all the flavors to meld together as the beans baked. When served hot, the beans had a rich, hearty texture with just the right amount of sweetness and smokiness from the bacon. Baked beans with bacon wasn't just a side, it was the kind of dish that brought a sense of comfort and home-cooked goodness to the table. Whether served alongside a summer barbecue, a winter stew, or a simple weeknight meal, these beans became a farm kitchen classic. Their versatility and ability to feed a crowd made them a staple for farm families during the 1970s. And even today, they're a reminder of the kind of resourceful cooking that made farm life so special. Dish 12, biscuits and gravy. Biscuits and gravy is the quintessential comfort food, and for farm families in the 1970s, it was often a hearty breakfast to start the day off right. Simple, satisfying, and downright delicious, this dish was made from ingredients that were easily available on any farm: flour, butter, milk, and sausage, and could be whipped up in no time. For farm families with long, hard days of work ahead of them, biscuits and gravy were the kind of meal that could stick to your ribs and provide the energy needed to get through a long day in the fields or the barn. The foundation of biscuits and gravy lay in the biscuits themselves: fluffy, golden, and slightly crisp on the outside, soft and buttery on the inside. They were made with flour, butter, baking powder, and milk, all mixed together quickly and baked in a hot oven until they puffed up to perfection. The biscuits were the perfect canvas for the rich, creamy gravy that would smother them. The gravy, of course, was the star of the show. It was made from the drippings of sausage, which provided a flavorful, savory base. The sausage was browned in a skillet, breaking up into small crumbles that would cook in their own fat. After the sausage was cooked, flour was added to the pan to create a roux, which would thicken the gravy as milk was gradually stirred in. The mixture was simmered until it reached the perfect consistency: thick, creamy, and just the right amount of savory. Salt and pepper were essential to season the gravy, and for a little extra kick, some farm families added a pinch of cayenne pepper or crushed red pepper flakes. When served, the hot, flaky biscuits were split open and smothered with the creamy sausage gravy. Each bite was a heavenly combination of soft, buttery biscuit and rich, savory gravy. Biscuits and gravy were often enjoyed for breakfast, but it was so filling that it could easily be eaten for lunch or dinner as well. It was the ultimate in comfort food, and for farm families in the 1970s, it was a beloved dish that brought warmth and satisfaction to the table. Whether on a cold winter morning or after a long, hard day of farm work, biscuits and gravy were the kind of meal that always felt like home. Dish 13, squash casserole. When you think of farm cooking, squash casserole is one of those dishes that immediately brings to mind the bounty of a summer garden and the way farm families made the most of every season's harvest. Squash, particularly summer squash, was easy to grow and abundant in the garden, making it an ideal ingredient for creating a satisfying, comforting dish. For farm families in the 1970s, squash casserole wasn't just a side dish. It was a celebration of the season and a way to transform a humble vegetable into something that felt both hearty and indulgent. The dish typically began with fresh squash, often zucchini or yellow squash, that would be sliced and sautéed until tender. Some families chose to cook the squash with onions or garlic, adding extra layers of flavor before mixing it with the rest of the casserole ingredients. Once softened, the squash was combined with a creamy mixture of eggs, mayonnaise, and a bit of cheese, cheddar being a popular choice, creating a smooth, comforting filling. The casserole would then be topped with a crunchy breadcrumb or cracker topping that baked to a golden crisp in the oven. This contrast between the creamy filling and the crunchy topping made every bite a little more special. Squash casserole was one of those dishes that could be made in advance, making it perfect for busy farm families who often had a long list of chores to complete. It could also be served at large family gatherings, as it made a generous amount and could easily be stretched to feed a crowd. The dish had a rustic, homey quality to it, a reminder of the way farm families used their gardens to create meals that were both practical and full of love. Over time, families added their own personal twists, some incorporating shredded cheese directly into the casserole, others using a combination of breadcrumbs and crumbled crackers to top the dish. But regardless of the variations, squash casserole remained a beloved seasonal dish, and in the 1970s, it became a mainstay at farm tables, often served alongside roasted meats or other hearty sides. With its creamy texture, golden crust, and earthy flavor, squash casserole was a dish that captured the essence of farm cooking: simple, nourishing, and full of warmth. Dish 14, chicken pot pie. On a farm, there was no better way to use up a roasted chicken or leftovers from Sunday's dinner than by making chicken pot pie. A staple in many farm kitchens during the 1970s, chicken pot pie was the epitome of comfort food. It combined the rich flavors of tender chicken, vegetables, and a creamy sauce, all encased in a flaky, buttery pie crust. This dish was the perfect solution for stretching a small amount of meat into a hearty, satisfying meal, and it could easily be made in large batches to feed a family after a long day of farm work. The filling of chicken pot pie was the heart of the dish. Leftover roast chicken was shredded and mixed with vegetables, typically carrots, peas, and onions, ingredients that were commonly found in farm gardens or could be easily preserved. The vegetables were then combined with a creamy sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Some families added chicken broth or a bit of cream for extra richness, while others seasoned it with herbs like thyme or parsley. The result was a creamy, savory mixture that was both filling and comforting. The most beloved part of chicken pot pie, however, was the crust. Farm families in the 1970s often made their own pie crusts from scratch. The dough, made from simple ingredients like flour, butter, and water, was rolled out and draped over the pie filling, sealing in the warmth and creating a golden, crispy topping. Some recipes called for a top crust only, while others featured a bottom crust as well, making the dish even heartier. As the pie baked in the oven, the crust would turn golden and flaky, while the filling bubbled up, creating the perfect balance between a crisp exterior and a creamy interior. Chicken pot pie wasn't just for dinner. It was a dish that could feed a family for days, with leftovers being perfect for lunch or dinner the next day. And even though it was a simple dish made from a few basic ingredients, it became something more than just a meal. It was a way for farm families to savor the harvest, make the most of what they had, and enjoy a comforting, satisfying dish that brought the family together at the end of a long day. In the 1970s, chicken pot pie was the kind of meal that made the home feel warm and welcoming, and its timeless appeal is still felt today. Dish 15. Sausage, gravy, and biscuits. Sausage gravy and biscuits is a dish that has become synonymous with comfort food, particularly in the southern and farm kitchens of the 1970s. It's simple, hearty, and filling, everything a farm family needed to start the day right. The beauty of this dish lies in its ability to take a few humble ingredients, flour, milk, sausage, and butter, and transform them into a meal that feels indulgent, even though it's made from pantry staples. The dish begins with the sausage. Many farm families raised their own pigs, which meant fresh, flavorful sausage could be made right at home. The sausage would be crumbled and cooked in a skillet until it was nicely browned, with the rendered fat providing the base for the gravy. Some families spiced their sausage with sage or other herbs, while others kept it simple with salt and pepper, allowing the natural flavor of the meat to shine through. Once the sausage was cooked, flour was added to the pan to create a roux, a thickening agent that would turn the sausage drippings into a rich, creamy gravy. After the flour had cooked briefly, milk was slowly poured in, and the gravy was stirred constantly to avoid lumps. The result was a smooth, velvety sauce, thickened just enough to coat the back of a spoon. Seasoning was key in sausage gravy, and most families added plenty of salt and pepper to balance the richness of the gravy and enhance the savory flavor of the sausage. The biscuits, of course, were the heart of this dish. Farm families often made their own biscuits from scratch, using flour, butter, and milk. The dough was mixed quickly and dropped by spoonfuls onto a baking sheet, where they baked up golden and fluffy. The biscuits provided a perfect vessel for the rich, savory gravy, with their light and flaky texture offering a delightful contrast to the creamy sauce. Sausage gravy and biscuits wasn't just a meal, it was an experience, one that brought warmth to the table and fueled the family for a long day's work. For farm families in the 1970s, it was a comforting, hearty reminder of the simple pleasures of homemade cooking. Dish 16. Potato soup. Potato soup is one of those dishes that embodies the comfort and warmth of a farm kitchen. Simple yet hearty, it became a staple for farm families in the 1970s, especially during the colder months when fresh vegetables were abundant and the need for a filling, warm meal was most pressing. Potatoes, one of the easiest crops to grow and store, were a key ingredient in farm cooking, and potato soup allowed families to make the most of this versatile vegetable. It was a dish that could be thrown together quickly with minimal ingredients, but when done right, it became the ultimate comfort food. The foundation of potato soup was, of course, the potatoes. They were peeled and diced into small cubes before being simmered in a pot with onions, garlic, and a rich broth. often made from chicken or vegetable stock. Some families added a touch of salt and pepper to season, but the real magic came when the potatoes started to soften and release their starch into the broth, thickening it into a creamy, velvety base. The soup could be left chunky, with bits of potato floating in the broth, or it could be blended for a smoother, creamier texture. To make the soup even heartier, many families added milk or cream to give the dish a richness that was both filling and satisfying. Bacon was a common addition. Its smoky flavor added depth to the soup, and its crispy texture made for a lovely contrast when sprinkled on top. Some families like to top their potato soup with shredded cheese, sour cream, or chives, adding a fresh pop of flavor and texture. Potato soup was often served with homemade bread or biscuits, perfect for dipping into the creamy broth and soaking up every last drop. It was a dish that could easily be doubled or tripled, making it ideal for large farm families or for those times when neighbors or extended family were gathering for a meal. It was also a great way to use up any leftover potatoes, making it a practical dish that could be enjoyed in many forms. For farm families in the 1970s, potato soup wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol of resourcefulness, comfort, and the ability to turn simple ingredients into something that felt like a warm embrace after a long day of hard work. Dish 17. Tater Tot Casserole. Tater tot casserole is one of those down-home, stick-to-your-ribs dishes that became a favorite on many farm tables during the 1970s. A true example of resourceful cooking, this casserole made use of inexpensive, readily available ingredients to create a meal that was both filling and comforting. The key ingredient, of course, was the tater tot, those crispy, golden brown potato morsels that were a convenient and crowd-pleasing option for farm families looking to put together a quick and hearty meal. The beauty of tater tot casserole was in its simplicity. The base of the dish usually consisted of ground beef, which was browned and then combined with a simple mixture of cream of mushroom soup and some seasoning. The soup provided a creamy, savory foundation that was perfect for holding everything together. Some families added sautéed onions, garlic, or even bell peppers for a bit of extra flavor and texture. Once the meat and soup mixture was combined, it was spread out in a casserole dish, and the tater tots were arranged on top, covering the entire surface. As the casserole baked in the oven, the tater tots became golden and crispy, while the meat and soup filling bubbled and melded together into a creamy, savory mixture. The result was a dish that was hearty, flavorful, and completely satisfying. Many farm families enjoyed it for dinner, served with a simple side of green beans or a salad. It was the kind of dish that could feed a hungry crew, and it often made enough for leftovers, which were just as delicious the next day. Tater tot casserole was also incredibly adaptable. While the base of the dish was usually made with ground beef and cream of mushroom soup, many families used what they had on hand. Some swapped in ground turkey or pork, while others added cheese for extra richness. The casserole was a great way to use up whatever vegetables or leftovers were lingering in the fridge, making it a practical and versatile meal. For farm families in the 1970s, tater tot casserole was more than just a quick meal. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest ingredients could come together to create something truly satisfying. Dish 18. Country ham with red-eye gravy. Country ham with red-eye gravy is a classic Southern dish that made its way onto many farm tables in the 1970s. This dish, with its rich, savory flavors, was the epitome of farm-style comfort food, simple, flavorful, and steeped in tradition. Country ham, known for its salty, smoky flavor, was often cured on the farm and served as a treat during special occasions or Sunday dinners. Paired with red-eye gravy, a rich, flavorful sauce made from the pan drippings of the ham, it became a meal that farm families savored, often served with biscuits or grits to soak up the gravy. The preparation of country ham was an art in itself. It was typically salted and smoked for preservation, creating a ham that could be stored for months. When it was time to serve it, the ham was sliced thick and fried in a skillet until the fat rendered and the edges became crispy. The result was a ham that was both tender and salty, with a crispy exterior that added texture to each bite. The real magic of this dish, however, was in the red-eye gravy. After frying the ham, the drippings left in the skillet were deglazed with black coffee, which added a unique depth of flavor. The coffee mixed with the rendered ham fat to create a savory, slightly bitter sauce that perfectly complemented the rich, salty ham. The gravy was simmered briefly until it thickened, and then it was poured over the fried ham, creating a deliciously decadent combination. Country ham with red-eye gravy was typically served with biscuits, which could be split open and soaked in the rich, flavorful gravy. Some families also served it with grits or fried potatoes, making for a truly indulgent meal. While it was a dish that required a little extra effort, the end result was always worth it. The combination of the smoky, salty ham and the deep, flavorful gravy was one that farm families in the 1970s cherished, both for its taste and its connection to their heritage. For farm families, this dish wasn't just about food. It was a reminder of a time when food was made from the land, when every meal was an opportunity to savor the fruits of hard work, and when the simplest ingredients could create something unforgettable. Dish 19. Fried green tomatoes. Fried green tomatoes are a Southern classic that found a special place on the farm table during the 1970s. Born out of necessity, since green tomatoes are often picked before they fully ripen, they became a popular way to make use of an abundant garden crop. For farm families, particularly in the South, these crispy, golden delights were a perfect way to savor the fruits of the garden long before the tomatoes were ripe for salads or sauces. Whether served as a side dish or as a snack, fried green tomatoes were beloved for their tangy flavor and crunchy exterior, providing a delicious contrast to the soft, juicy interior. To prepare fried green tomatoes, the first step was to select firm green tomatoes, those that hadn't yet ripened but were large enough to slice. The tomatoes were sliced into thick rounds, dusted with a seasoned cornmeal or flour coating, and then fried to a crispy perfection in hot oil. Some families added a touch of salt, pepper, and a little cayenne or paprika to the coating for a bit of extra flavor. The key to great fried green tomatoes was the balance between a crispy, golden exterior and the tender, slightly tart flesh inside. The result was a crispy, savory bite that contrasted beautifully with the bright acidity of the green tomatoes. Fried green tomatoes were often served with a simple dipping sauce, sometimes a tangy ranch dressing, a spicy remoulade, or even a drizzle of honey. They could be enjoyed as an appetizer, a side dish with fried chicken or roast pork, or even as a main dish, depending on the amount of tomatoes available. They were perfect for a summer meal when the garden was overflowing, and farm families could use up the tomatoes that wouldn't last long enough to ripen. For many, fried green tomatoes became a nostalgic symbol of farm life. They were a meal that not only made the most of the garden's harvest, but also reflected the resourcefulness of farm families, turning something simple and often overlooked into a beloved, flavorful dish. Whether served at the family table or shared with neighbors, fried green tomatoes were a dish that brought people together over the shared bounty of the land. Dish 20. Pork roast with sauerkraut. Pork roast with sauerkraut is a classic comfort food that has stood the test of time, particularly for farm families in the 1970s. This hearty dish combined two farm staples, pork and cabbage, into a meal that was both flavorful and filling. While the combination of pork and sauerkraut is often associated with German heritage, it became a favorite in farm kitchens across the country due to its simplicity, its ability to be cooked in large quantities, and its deep, satisfying flavors. The acidity of the sauerkraut balanced out the richness of the pork, creating a dish that was both savory and slightly tangy. To make the dish, a well-seasoned pork roast, often a shoulder or loin cut, would be slow cooked with sauerkraut. Some farm families added apples or onions for sweetness, while others flavored the sauerkraut with caraway seeds or bay leaves to deepen the flavor. The roast was seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a little garlic or thyme, then placed in a roasting pan on top of the sauerkraut. The pork and sauerkraut were cooked low and slow, allowing the flavors to meld together as the pork became tender and the sauerkraut softened, releasing its tartness into the meat. As the pork roasted, its juices would mix with the sauerkraut, creating a savory, flavorful sauce that could be spooned over mashed potatoes or served alongside bread. The result was a satisfying, hearty dish that filled the stomach and warmed the soul. The pork roast was typically served with mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, or sometimes a simple green vegetable like peas or green beans, all of which helped to balance the richness of the pork and the tang of the sauerkraut. Pork roast with sauerkraut was a meal that could feed a crowd, making it ideal for farm families who often had large gatherings. It also made excellent leftovers, with the flavors intensifying the next day. For many farm families in the 1970s, this dish became a symbol of homey comfort, simple ingredients, and a meal that could bring the family together around the table after a long day of work. Whether served for a Sunday dinner or a special occasion, Pork roast with sauerkraut was a beloved dish that made the most of farm-fresh ingredients. Dish 21, chicken and rice casserole. Chicken and rice casserole was a go-to dish in many farm kitchens during the 1970s, combining the comfort of tender chicken with the heartiness of rice in one easy-to-make, all-in-one meal. This dish was the perfect solution for busy farm families looking for a satisfying, flavorful meal that could be thrown together quickly and baked in the oven. It made use of simple, affordable ingredients that were always on hand, chicken, rice, and a few basic pantry items, and turned them into something comforting and filling. The base of the casserole was usually a combination of cooked chicken, often left over from a roast or a chicken raised on the farm, rice, and a creamy sauce. The chicken was shredded or cut into pieces and combined with rice, while the sauce typically consisted of cream of mushroom soup, some milk, and a little butter to add richness. Salt, pepper, and seasonings like garlic powder or onion powder were used to flavor the dish, though some farm families like to add a touch of cheese for extra richness. Once the chicken, rice, and sauce were mixed together, the casserole was poured into a baking dish and topped with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers. The casserole was then baked until the top became golden and crispy, while the rice absorbed the creamy sauce and the chicken became tender and flavorful. The result was a comforting dish that could easily feed a family, and it often made enough for leftovers, which were just as good the next day. Chicken and rice casserole was versatile too. Farm families could adjust the recipe depending on what they had on hand. Some added vegetables like peas or carrots to the dish, while others swapped the cream of mushroom soup for cream of chicken soup. The casserole was also a great way to use up any leftover rice or vegetables, making it a practical and economical choice. For farm families in the 1970s, chicken and rice casserole was more than just a meal. It was a reminder of the comfort that came from cooking with simple, homegrown ingredients and the joy of sharing a filling dish with those you loved. Whether served as a weeknight dinner or a special treat, it was a dish that never failed to satisfy. Dish 22. Beef and noodles. Beef and noodles was a classic farm meal that brought together tender beef and hearty noodles, creating a dish that was both comforting and filling. For farm families in the 1970s, beef was often raised on the farm, making it a regular part of the diet. While steaks and roasts were staples, many farm families also made use of tougher cuts of meat by slow cooking them in stews or casseroles. Beef and noodles was one such dish, where tough beef was transformed into a rich, savory meal that could be served over noodles or pasta, making it a great way to stretch the ingredients. The dish typically started with beef stew meat, which was browned in a large pot to develop flavor before being simmered for several hours until it was tender. Onions, garlic, and sometimes carrots were added to the pot to enhance the flavor, and the meat was then cooked in a flavorful broth made from beef stock or water. The slow simmering process broke down the meat, turning it into melt-in-your-mouth tenderness. This was the key to the dish: patience. The beef, after hours of simmering, absorbed the full depth of the broth, making each bite succulent and flavorful. Once the beef was tender, the noodles were added. Fresh or dried egg noodles were a common choice on the farm, and they were cooked right in the same pot, soaking up all the savory flavors of the beef and broth. The noodles softened and expanded, melding perfectly with the rich, meaty sauce. The result was a thick, comforting dish with every spoonful filled with tender beef, flavorful broth, and soft noodles that absorbed the essence of the entire dish. Beef and noodles was the kind of meal that could be made in large quantities, which was especially helpful for large farm families. Leftovers were a bonus, as the dish only seemed to get better the next day when the flavors had time to deepen. Served with a side of fresh bread or cornbread, this meal provided warmth and sustenance after a long day of farm work. The simplicity of the ingredients, combined with the richness of the beef and broth, made it a beloved dish in the 1970s farm kitchen. A perfect example of how hearty, home-cooked meals could be made from a few basic ingredients and turn into something extraordinary. Dish 23, meat and potato soup. Meat and potato soup was a staple in many farm households during the 1970s. It was the kind of hearty, filling soup that could be made in large pots to feed a hungry family after a long day in the fields. Made with simple ingredients that were easy to come by on a farm, potatoes, meat, and onions, this soup was a perfect example of how farm families could take the most basic of ingredients and create something comforting, warming, and satisfying. The key to this soup was the meat. Often, it was leftover roast beef or any other cuts of meat that might be tough or fatty, items that wouldn't typically be served as standalone cuts, but were perfect for slow cooking in a soup. The meat would be diced and browned in a large pot, developing a rich, savory base for the soup. Onions, carrots, and celery were added to give the soup depth, along with seasonings like salt, pepper, and thyme to enhance the flavor. The soup's richness came from the meat's natural juices, which melded with the vegetables as they simmered together. After the vegetables softened, potatoes were added to the pot. The potatoes were peeled and diced into small chunks, and they helped thicken the soup as they cooked, giving it a hearty, filling texture. The potatoes also absorbed the flavors of the meat and broth, making each bite comforting and satisfying. As the soup simmered, the flavors developed and deepened, creating a rich, hearty dish that was perfect for cold winter evenings or any time a warm meal was needed. Meat and potato soup was often served with bread or crackers to soak up the rich, savory broth. The leftovers were even better the next day, making this a dish that could feed a family for multiple meals. It was also a great way to stretch the meat, allowing farm families to make the most of every cut. Simple yet nourishing, this soup was a go-to meal that provided both warmth and sustenance during long, busy days on the farm. Dish 24, farm-style beef tacos. Tacos are often thought of as a dish best enjoyed with fresh ingredients from the store, but for farm families in the 1970s, beef tacos were a great way to use up leftovers and feed a hungry family on a budget. Beef was often raised right on the farm, and tacos became a fun and flavorful way to turn leftover roast beef or ground beef into something exciting. With a few simple ingredients like tortillas, cheese, and vegetables, farm-style beef tacos became a beloved meal that brought a bit of spice to the dinner table. The base of the dish was usually ground beef, which was seasoned with spices like cumin, chili powder, garlic, and paprika, flavors that were commonly found in farm kitchens. The beef was browned in a skillet and seasoned to taste. Some families added onions or peppers to the mix, creating a more complex flavor profile. The ground beef was then piled into soft or crispy tortillas with toppings that were often sourced from the farm or local garden. Shredded lettuce, tomatoes, and onions provided crunch and freshness, while shredded cheese added richness. Sometimes a dollop of sour cream or a squeeze of lime would finish off the tacos, giving them a creamy tang. And while tacos are often thought of as a dish with a variety of toppings, farm families kept it simple, relying on what they had on hand. The tacos were often served with a side of rice or beans, which were affordable and filling, making this a meal that could easily feed a large family. Farm-style beef tacos became a go-to dinner for farm families in the 1970s because they were easy to make, versatile, and fun. They were a great way to use up leftover beef and make the most of what was available. Whether served on a weeknight or for a special family gathering, these tacos brought a taste of spice and variety to the farm kitchen and were a reminder that even the simplest meals could be full of flavor and joy. Dish 25, Apple Crisp. Apple Crisp is a perfect example of the kind of dessert that farm families in the 1970s could create using fresh, in-season ingredients. Apples, often picked directly from the farm orchard, formed the base of this comforting dessert. Sweet and slightly tart, the apples paired perfectly with the buttery, cinnamon-spiced oat topping, creating a dessert that was both delicious and easy to prepare. Apple Crisp wasn't just a treat. It was a celebration of the fall harvest and a way to make the most of apples that were ripening in abundance. The dish began with fresh apples that were peeled, cored, and sliced. Depending on the family's taste, the apples were sweetened with sugar and seasoned with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes a bit of lemon juice to enhance the fruit's natural flavor. The apples were arranged in a baking dish, ready to be covered by a crumbly topping made from oats, flour, butter, brown sugar, and a pinch of salt. The topping would be sprinkled generously over the apples, creating a crispy golden layer as it baked in the oven. As the apple crisp baked, the apples softened and released their juices, creating a warm, sweet filling. The oat topping became golden and crunchy, providing the perfect contrast to the tender, spiced apples beneath. Once it was finished, the apple crisp was served warm, often topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream or a dollop of whipped cream. Apple Crisp was the kind of dessert that was simple but deeply satisfying, and it had the advantage of using ingredients that were readily available on the farm. It was a great way to use up apples that were starting to ripen, and it could easily be made in large batches to feed a crowd. For farm families in the 1970s, apple crisp was a beloved dessert that brought the sweetness of the harvest to the table, providing a comforting end to a hearty meal. It was a dish that represented the simple pleasures of farm life: seasonal ingredients, family togetherness, and the warmth of a home-cooked meal. The meals that defined farm life in the 1970s were not just about feeding the body, they were about nourishment for the soul. They were born from the land, shaped by the seasons, and crafted with a deep understanding of how to make the most out of simple ingredients. Each dish, whether it was a hearty bowl of potato soup, a savory roast with sauerkraut, or the comforting crunch of fried green tomatoes, represented the resourcefulness, love, and care that went into every meal. For farm families, food was a way of life. It was about gathering around the table after a long day of work, sharing stories, and finding solace in the warmth of a home-cooked meal. These dishes weren't just recipes. They were traditions, passed down through generations, each one carrying with it the history and heart of the farm. They were meals made from scratch, from the garden, the hen house, and the fields, and they were always made with an understanding of the value of hard work and simplicity. In the 1970s, farm kitchens were the heart of the home, and the meals served there were not only satisfying, but also a reflection of the ingenuity and resourcefulness that defined farm life. As we look back on these dishes, we're reminded of a time when cooking was more than just a task. It was a celebration of the land and the community that helped sustain it. Whether you're recreating these meals in your own kitchen or simply reflecting on the past, these dishes hold a timeless charm. They remind us of a simpler time when meals were made with what you had, and the act of sharing food was a meaningful way to connect with family and tradition.